Last panel. So I first introduce myself. I'm Caspar Hare. I am co-director of SERC with Georgia. And yeah, I have that pleasure. So we have a few computer science majors at MIT. They're a tiny sort of embattled minority of our majors, but they're there. And the question is, what are we going to teach them? So it's often said that computing is a socially transformative technology. So we want to educate our students to be intentional in understanding what the social impact of the technologies that they're going to be developing, what those social impacts are. And also that we want to teach our students to know how to assess whether or not those social impacts are, broadly speaking, for the good or for the bad. And the question is how you do that. And so we've invited 3 people here who have experience in teaching the ethics and thinking about the social implications and ethics of computing. And so that's Eden, Milo, and John. So I'd like you just to introduce yourselves, if possible, say who you are and what you teach.
Sure. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Eden Medina. I'm Associate Professor of Science, Technology, and Society. I teach in the program for Science, Technology, and Society. And some of the courses that I teach at the undergraduate level include Data and Society, which is the course I'm teaching right now. And I also do an undergraduate course on computing and social change.
I'm Milo Phillips-Brown. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Oxford. I'm a philosopher, and I teach ethics courses in the computer science department. So I teach a class that's required for all of the first-year computer science students, and then also an upper-level class. And I built a lot of the methods that I teach now here at MIT, where I was a graduate student and a postdoc, so collaborated with people across the Department of Engineering and SHAS to develop, I think we developed like 13 modules of ethics content, SERC content that was taught in computer science classrooms, and then also 3 standalone classes.
Hi, I'm John Basil. I'm an associate professor of philosophy across the river at Northeastern University. I'm also a member of the Ethics Institute, where I lead AI and data ethics initiatives. I teach both courses in philosophy in AI and data ethics. I teach an Intro to Ethics of Emerging Technology course and an upper-level AI ethics course. And I also help design and sometimes deliver our computer science ethics modules across the curriculum.
OK, so I know the 3 of you emphasize different things in your different approaches in your courses. And so I'd like to ask some questions that sort of to bring that out. So Eden, I know that you have, you're a strong believer in the idea that students can learn from history. And that by foregrounding the history of tech, we can well prepare our students to think about the implications of the technology they're going to be developing. So can you tell us about that? And
Sure. I would be happy to. So first of all, thank you for including me on this panel. I have been working in the education of computing students and computing adjacent students and trying to talk about social, ethical, and responsible computing for over 15 years. So it's something that I've thought about and have tried teaching it in different veins and thinking about the best way to do this. And I just want to start by saying that we're in a pretty incredible moment for those of us who teach in this area. There is such emphasis right now on thinking about ethics and computer science education, in a ways that we haven't seen in the past. And at the same time, the kinds of quandaries that we're being presented with are pretty serious quandaries. So both in terms of the questions that are coming at us and the interest, in responsible computing research and education, I just want to put out there that it's a pretty incredible time. And I also want to put out there, while it's fantastic that we're giving attention to ethics, ethics is one approach among a number of approaches that can be used in the area of responsible computing. So while it is important, and I stress it is really important to teach good behaviors, how to make decisions when you're coming into these ethical, murky areas, It is also, I think there are other toolboxes that we can use in our teaching to get across that some of these areas are pretty murky and that they are deeply contextualized. And a lot of times what we see are people who want to do good, right? Who want to make changes for the better. They want to change the world for the better. They're acting with good intentions, but they don't understand the full implications of their work. Right? They don't understand the consequences. And in some ways, like, how can they possibly understand the full consequences? Because these are such difficult and complex issues. And also because often the way that we frame computing, we frame everything as new. And so one of the things that I do in my teaching is I look at how people have confronted these issues in the past and try to draw from the past as a way for us to think about possible ways forward. And this could mean drawing from insights of historians or concepts that they've developed. So for example, one thing that I do with my students is, whenever we hear that this technology is the best technology, like, I want it to be a reflex, like, best for whom, right? To get it in your body, like, oh, this is the best for whom? So in some cases, it can be taking insights from historians or those who are working in adjacent fields like science and technology studies. It can also be thinking about case studies and specific case examples. So I've thought about 2 cases, one from another historian and one from my own research, that I thought that I would just present briefly as a way of seeing how history could contribute to the way that we're teaching computer science students. And what I think that these case studies really do is they show that decisions about technologies, decisions about data, grow out of very specific contexts, right? They're decisions made by people in context for specific goals, and they could have been otherwise. And I think that recognition that things could have been otherwise is actually quite empowering, because even though we didn't pursue those directions, we know that they're out there, and those potentially could give us inspiration for other computing possibilities in the future. So I just want to flag that. So the first example that I'm going to briefly present is by a brilliant historian of science at Yale University named Joanna Radin. And it's an example that I use in my teaching all the time, especially in my data and society class. And so if there are educators in the audience that are looking for interesting examples, the name of the paper is Digital Natives, and it appears in the journal Osiris. And I really like this paper for a number of reasons, one of which is that it focuses on data. And when we're talking about computing and ethical computing, especially in the area of machine learning and AI, we really need to be thinking about the data. And I think this paper does a great job of raising some of the ethical issues that are related to data that we don't often consider. So the paper is about a particular data set commonly known as the PIMA data set, but its longer form would be the PIMA Indian diabetes data set. And so I don't know if any of you have worked with the data set, if any of that data set sounds familiar to any of you. Previously, when I taught my data and society class, I had at least one student who had come across it in a classroom setting. So it's, it's a data set that at least used to be used quite commonly. And it is a popular data set because it is so complete. It is a data set that has been generated as a result of over 40 years of longitudinal research of diabetes in an indigenous community. And the indigenous community is the Pima Gila River Indian community. Medical research on diabetes on that community started in 1965, and researchers started to visit that community and collect information on diabetes there because it was viewed as a model community because rates of diabetes were so high. Now, from an ethical framing, since we're thinking about computer ethics, the history of this data set is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it is highlighting the experiences of an indigenous community, which is something that isn't always highlighted in discussions of computing. But it also shows the limitations of how we often frame discussions of computer ethics. So I would say, it's probably fair to say that most people who are using this data set think of it as a data set that is available to use freely to train machine learning algorithms, and that's kind of the extent that they know of it. In fact, Radin, when she first talks about the data set, she mentions that she met a mathematician that was using the data set to train machine learning algorithms to detect underground electrical fires in New York City. So a data set that was developed, in the course of longitudinal studies of diabetes are getting repurposed to detect underground electrical fires. So there's like this process of abstraction that is happening. But Radin points us to the fact that the history of this data set is actually much, much longer. And in order to understand the history of the data set, we need to go back to the 19th century. And we need to go back to the history of this community that grew around the presence of a river that, as settler migration started to increase at the end of the 19th century into Arizona, the area that is now Arizona, where the community is located, started to divert the river, started to dam the river, and made it impossible or next to impossible for this community to grow food. And as a result, members of this community started to starve. And the US government intervened to send food to this community, the indigenous community, and they sent canned food and heavily processed food. And it's through the sending and this change of diet towards one that is based on canned food and processed food that the diabetes and the obesity epidemic begins among this population. So, even going back to, why this data set exists, the existence of this data set is tied in very real ways to histories of colonialism, to displacement, to violence, to subjugation. And looking at the history of this data set reveals disparities in power. Second, the history of this data set is interesting because it shows that the community that has given their data for decades has not directly benefited from the research that has been conducted on them. Indeed, as Radin points out, over the 40 years of this study, incidents of diabetes and obesity have not declined in this community in any meaningful way. Which raises the question about informed consent, right? One of the things we teach is about informed consent. Did this community consent to give their medical data to be experimental subjects for medical discoveries that would benefit other communities but not their own, right? What exactly did they consent to, and how did they understand consent at that moment? And while the actions of the community have been framed in the scientific literature, as Radin shows, as acts of generosity, as acts of donation, as acts of giving, we can also view those as relationships of extraction. And finally, third, the data set is interesting because as it now sits in a data repository for future use, only the medical researchers are listed as authors, which is interesting, right? So in addition to seeing how this very real, grounded data set was created, we see how it gets extracted, and those who have given the data have been removed from the materials of their bodies, and the data set becomes affiliated with medical researchers, which also raises issues of consent around data reuse, right? Did members of this community consent to have their medical data used to predict electrical fires underneath New York City, right? So by having these kinds of intricate case studies, we get to see histories of informed consent that go beyond that immediate moment of signing a form to say you agree to participate in a study. Informed consent can last decades, right? It can not only apply to data use, it can apply to data reuse. It illustrates how processes of data collection can be extractive, and also how computer technologies sit in very real ways over relationships of settler colonial power. And so I think that that's really important for when we teach computer ethics, that we need to think not only about how we frame the problem as one of right or wrong, or not only how we think of it as a space of immediacy, we have a new technology, in the lab that we need to think through, but oftentimes these technologies are part of longer historical processes of inequality, of extraction, of violence, of disparity in power, et cetera, and that these are also the things that we have to grapple with when we think about computer ethics and when we think about repair. How do we think about repair and building more responsible systems in the future? The second example that I want to touch on just briefly, that people can think about using in their teaching, comes from my own research. And it is about a computer system that was developed in Chile in the 1970s. So to allow the government to be able to run the economy in real time, to run it using real-time data, and at the push of a button. And we don't have slides that I can show you, but if you have your phone out, if you have your computer out, I encourage you to Google Cybersyn Operations Room, so CYBERSYN. You will see this incredible photo of a room that was built in Chile in the early 1970s, in 1972 to be exact. And it looks like something out of Star Trek, right? It looks like something out of 2001. It's quite an evocative image. And I believe this case study, and in particular the image of the room, is great for teaching and thinking about computers historically and ethics of computing historically. First of all, because it shows that people have been interested in data-driven governance for a long time. Like, this is not new. Secondly, people have been interested in real-time data for governance for a long time, so also nothing new. And these projects have taken on different forms, but they've often not met the ways that they've been presented. So they've often fell short of the ways that they've been presented or the hype that has surrounded them. But also, these projects show, so this is a case that was developed in South America, in Chile, and it shows that computer histories are global. They come from everywhere, right? So it is not just stories of US histories of technologies. We're not only thinking about ethics and responsible computing, drawing on examples of US experiences or experiences in the global north. Innovation happens everywhere. And I would argue that it is an ethical responsibility of us as educators to provide our students with case examples that are global in nature. So also putting that out there. I would finally argue that the design of the room itself, so if any of you are looking at the room, is great for teaching, because just if you look at the architecture of the environment, you can ask yourself, if I wanted to design a democratic space, what would it look like? And in this room, we see 7 chairs that are in an inward-facing circle. No one is at a head of a table. 7 odd number, which is good for voting, which we can contrast from other control rooms, such as one developed by the NSA, where you have kind of like one Captain Kirk chair in the middle. So we can think about, how values are built into built environments and technological design. We can think about how biases travel with us. So this control room was designed explicitly to be masculine and encourage masculine forms of communication. And I think it's just very powerful to point out that even when we have just utopian visions of how technology could be different, we're like building control systems to revolutionize society. Our biases travel with us in ways that we may not even recognize. So in this case, bias is about gender and who is going to be holding power in this government and making decisions in the room. And finally, one of the reasons why I find the room very interesting is because quite literally, there is someone behind the wall of the room that is changing the content of the screens and making sure everything runs smoothly. And it's just this wonderful, visible example of invisible human labor that is necessary for making automation appear to be automated. So I will just leave that there, just sharing some of my views on how history can help improve and speak to computer science education. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Eden. So, Milo, it might seem like one of the things we learn from history is that the social impact of technology is deeply unpredictable. So if you imagine someone early in the 19th century, just as the tech of fossil fuels and the combustion engine was starting to be developed, how impossible it would have been for them to foresee what changes that would enact upon the world. Planes, trains, automobiles, suburbs, mechanized war, the way the world looked 150 years later, it was just totally different. What could somebody in the early 19th century have seen? Very little. I know that you think that students can be trained to think in a better way, in a more accurate way, about what the social implications of the tech they're developing and designing, what they are. So could you tell us how you do that and whether it works?
Absolutely, yeah. So this question of how to foresee the future, or at least some of it, is, I think, part of a broader question that anyone who's sitting down to build or deploy a technology might face when they're thinking, how do I build this ethically or in a socially responsible way? That's just a really big question. Where do you go with that? You say, okay, I want to build this thing ethically. What does that mean? What do you do? So the open-endedness of that question can itself be stymieing. So when teaching ethics to computer science students, what we try to do, the approach we developed at MIT and I teach at Oxford, is to try to offer students a concrete step-by-step approach to breaking this question of how do I build technologies responsibly down into more manageable steps. And so although I'm a philosopher, the basic approach that we take very much draws on the fields of value-sensitive design, responsible research and innovation, participatory design as sort of like a guiding insights, and then is also fundamentally interdisciplinary. as you'll see very soon, drawing on history and various social sciences is sort of crucial to this project. Okay, so, but what is the project? What are these steps that we try to teach the students? It's something we call the ethical computing protocol, and it has 4 different steps. So the first that Caspar suggested is to identify possible impacts of whatever it is that you're sitting down to build. So it's often said that some technology has harmed people because certain effects were unintended or unforeseen. If we think, for example, of the pulse oximeter, which we talked about, which we heard about earlier today, the pulse oximeter works less well for certain darker skin tones. Think now about the person who was building or selling these take-home pulse oximeters that were sold at CVS now and during the pandemic. If you were to ask that person, or maybe whoever's working for this company, look, this product works not very well for people of certain demographics, and that has a potential to cause real harm. At least one version of the story there said, this certainly wasn't my intent. It's not something I saw coming. Maybe it was, and it wasn't profitable for them to do otherwise, but certainly it's a common refrain that the ill effects of technologies were not foreseen. But not foreseen doesn't mean not foreseeable. So there's certain kinds of work that one can do to figure out what might happen. One of them is research. So just knowing what has happened in the past can help you figure out what might happen in the future. So if you're sitting down, for example, to build a technology that uses a pulse oximeter, well, there's research out there that one could do to find out about racial disparities. And likewise, research on related technologies, like automatic soap dispensers, which also use refractive technologies to detect whether an object is there. Okay, so this is the first step to try to get an expansive view of how the technology that you're building might impact the world. The second step is to understand how those potential effects relate to the decisions that you're making when you're building the technology. So obviously we designed things in one way rather than another because we want the technology to be used in certain ways or to have certain effects rather than others. And we've got this hopefully relatively comprehensive, if never fully comprehensive map of what things might happen, how the technology might interact with the world. Now, what do we do as designers or implementers to make things go one way rather than another in this space of possible outcomes? So that's the second step. How do design decisions have certain implications for what might happen and those ethical and their ethical effects? The next step is to make choices, to deliberate from the normative point of view, which is, I think, something that John will talk about, so I won't touch so much on that here. And then the final step is to communicate about what it is that you think should be done. So it's all well and good for you to come to a decision yourself as somebody who's working on a product or conducting a certain kind of research. It's another thing to be able to convince those around you that this is the course of action to be taken, especially if it runs counter to profit interests or what might further certain goals of the lab that you're working in, for example. Anyway, okay, so that's the sort of the sketch of the steps that we teach students. I'll give you now a bit more of a concrete sense of what that looks like in the classroom. So generally, we teach this step-by-step protocol in 2 stages. First, we will work together with a class on hypothetical technology. So we'll all imagine that we are building a technology together, and guide the students to work through these steps one by one. So a common technology we like to use because of its many possible implications and a lot of space for choices in design is thinking about pretending that we are in a startup designing an electrified version of the kind of blue bikes that you see outside that you can just sort of rent for a day or for a commute. So we'll sit down with the students and we'll say, all right, so if you were building these sorts of blue bikes, what effects might it have on the world? What could happen? And we just have this sort of like barrage of different thought experiments and exercises to get the students to think creatively about this. So some of the questions are sort of outrageous. Would be like, if there were a Black Mirror episode, which is like a dystopian TV show about the blue bike technology, what would happen in it? So they would write like a little paragraph plot point, and then what would the title be? And then there are other sort of more mundane questions, like think about who your stakeholders are. So this is not just your shareholders, and it's not just your users. It's other people who might be affected indirectly. And even your users, or those who are affected indirectly, might not be affected all in the same way. So one thing that we'll ask students to do is to think of a stakeholder group or subgroup, say female users of the technology, and ask them to come up with 3 scenarios in which the technology does not work well for that group. So how do students come to do that? Well, one thing that we prompt them to do is to look into, as I sort of suggested before, do research on related technologies. So some students looked into, in the most recent iteration of this course, how surgical instruments have in many cases, particularly scissors, been designed for larger and on average male hands, which has resulted in it being more difficult for people with smaller hands to use the scissors, and also that it over time causes pain. So when you've got people of certain sizes using a certain kind of technology, that can have disparate impacts. Well, guess what can come in different sizes? Bikes. So we can imagine, this student imagined a future, for example, where the seats were very high on the bikes, and the space between the seats and the handlebars was also very large. So this makes it difficult, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps quite unsafe to ride. So this is a possible future that the students imagined through certain kinds of prompting and kinds of research that they're learning how to do. Okay, so we imagine some possible futures like that, and then we prompt students to think, how does this relate to design decisions? Well, in the case of the size of the bike, and sometimes it's like relatively clear. We can design the bike to be one size rather than another. Perhaps we allow certain parts of the bike to be adjustable. So the seats on the blue bikes that exist today are adjustable. But what's not adjustable is the space between the seat and the handlebars. That's something that's fixed. And so that's a choice that you're going to have to make when you're designing something like a blue bike. This is going to make the bike easier to ride for some people and harder for others, less safe to ride for some and safer from others. And here we also try to ask other sort of provocative questions to try to get students to think about the potential implications of the design choices. For example, we'll have students most recently identified that pedestrians who require assistive devices might be impacted by the presence of blue bikes on sidewalks. And so a question we ask the student is, if you were going to design the blue bikes to have as negative an impact as possible on those people, how would you design them? A so-called black hat question. And so students came up with, for example, well, you would not have a kickstand on the bike. So if somebody put it up parked it on the road, it would be much more likely to fall over onto the sidewalk, or you would have a very weak kickstand. Or you would, for example, not have docking stations. So there are different kinds of these blue bikes, some of which you park them, as I'm sure you have all seen. You park them like you do here at MIT. But in Oxford, there are no places to park them. You can just leave them wherever. So the more that blue bikes might just be placed on the sidewalk and falling over on the sidewalk, the worse it is for somebody who is, for example, in a wheelchair and for whom it's not easy for them to navigate around something obstructing their way. Okay, about to wrap up. So we've got the students then presented with these design choices about where they sort of traced out the ethical implications of what they were going to do. We then give them certain kinds of prompts of the kind that John will talk about, certain kinds of skills to answer those questions, and then further give them prompts, which I'm happy to talk about more if you're interested, in how to communicate about the choices and the investigations they've made into the technology. So the second part, I've sort of said that we teach this protocol in 2 steps. One is as a class together, where we say, let's work through this technology together. We sort of guide the students to understand with this example of the blue bikes. And then the students do it by themselves. So their homework or final project will be to apply the protocol to a technology that they themselves are building or would like to be building, and to understand and draw out the ethical implications of that for themselves.
Awesome. So yeah, it sounds like the protocol does this excellent job of attuning students to the possible social implications of the tech. And then there's this hole that we've yet to fill in, which is obviously part of it, but that John, I think, has some views about. When it comes to, suppose I've identified them, I know this is what the social impact is going to be. Is it fair or unfair? Good or bad? How do we get students to think in a deliberate, wise way about such things? John.
Well, that's a hard question. I came to answer easy questions. So you won't be shocked to learn that I, a moral philosopher, think that it's extremely important that students tackle fundamental issues like fairness and issues in political philosophy and moral philosophy. But I don't think in this case it's simply self-interested or making sure philosophers get a piece of the AI money pie or something like that. If you think about every other area where we do even a moderately decent job of managing ethical issues, we have an entire ethics ecosystem that distributes the function of ethical reasoning. So in bioethics, the military, the law, you have this whole subset of subcomponents that do that work. You have interdisciplinary researchers and scholars that can draw on fundamental research. You have oversight and regulation that tell you what has to be done. You have a translation of those regulations into operationalizations that frontline stakeholders or decision makers can just sort of operate on a checklist until they don't know what to do, and then they can draw on the interdisciplinary expertise. You have education programs that train the people into those operationalizations. In this space, we have none of that. And so for current generations of computer scientists and other decision makers, we're actually making them do the ethical reasoning on their own. Maybe in a few generations, and I'm not that optimistic about how few, we will have the full ecosystem and they will be asked to do less. But now, currently, they have to engage in the questions of, okay, I'm supposed to think about fairness when it comes to this decision-making context. What is fairness? So I go through this protocol thing. I become sensitized to identifying the ethical questions. Now, how do I develop responsiveness? You can't make every computer scientist a professional ethicist, but how do they know enough of the landscape so that they can seek out the relevant expertise, so they know the right questions to ask, so they know the right journal articles to go to, so they can grab the right research resources? I don't have a full answer to how to do that, except by teaching them core ethical reasoning skills, which I think happens across the curriculum, not just in philosophy classes. I think it's part of STS and sociology. But I think, just to give an example that sort of highlights this, I have another one in my pocket if we have more time, but I know we're short on that. This might be a sensitive example given our location, but let's talk a little bit about the MIT Moral Machine project, which for those that don't know about it is an online survey tool where users can go and they're presented with autonomous vehicle accident scenarios. Some of them have, a cat walking across the the crosswalk and a dog in the car. Some of them have people. Sometimes there's an illegal crossing. So it has a bunch of different variables. Things that are measures of social value, like whether someone is a doctor, things like that. And it asks users to pick between 2 scenarios. And it goes through 13 of this. And then it shows you which variables in that set that you were given mattered to you. Like, were you sensitive to social value? Were you sensitive to illegal crossing? Were you sensitive to having the car staying on its main course or diverting? Things like that. Now, some people just view, the moral machine has been subject to lots of discussion and criticism, and this isn't meant to be an additional one of those. Some people view it's generated millions of responses. Some people view it as a tool for just doing sociological research, like how do people in different cultures think of this? Others think you can take the aggregated preferences and use that to design how cars will actually drive. But notice there's a lot of fundamental assumptions there. One fundamental assumption there is that moral decision-making should be offloaded democratically, like that people should decide these sensitive ethical questions. And that on its face is very intuitive, but actually we don't think that in a large range of cases, even in the context where we do think decision-making should be sort of somehow socially legitimated, like when the government is exercising its authority. It's an open question in political philosophy about what does that legitimation and when. So for example, none of us think that, maybe some of you think this, we should vote on what the NSF funds. Instead, we democratically elect representatives who choose experts at the NSF who are supposed to do that decision-making. And what legitimates it is our electing them, or electing the people that choose them. So there's lots of intricate ways that democratic legitimation works, if democratic legitimation is even required. In many private decision-making contexts, even where it has social implications, we don't think that it's subject to democratic legitimacy constraints at all. And so then what's supposed to motivate sort of checking the vibes of the crowd? You might think it's something like, oh, just like when there's socially important things, there's no morally right answer, so we should do different things. But questions of cultural relativism are the bread and butter of a moral philosophy class. These are fundamental ethical questions that you would be trained to think really critically about and think about how they matter in basically any. Caspar doesn't teach, as far as I know, AI ethics, but that would come up in Caspar's moral philosophy course. And so that's just one example of, I think, developing core ethical reasoning skills, not to give them the answers in a moral philosophy class, but to train them that there's people that are experts, just like there are experts in computer science, there's experts in these other domains that are thinking through these problems with a special toolkit. And so I think that's essential to supplementing the kind of modular approach that Milo was talking about.
Do you have time for a couple of questions? Your call.
Yes.
Questions? Yes, please.
This is Arvind, Computer Science. Any of you have very different approaches to this problem, but one thing that is on our minds these days is ChatGPT, which raises enormous number of moral, ethical questions, and we still don't know how far it'll go, right? But as computer scientists, I like to believe it'll go very, very far. I mean, we're just seeing the beginning of it. What would you do in the classroom on such a topic?
So I just released my first homework assignment that uses ChatGPT today. So earlier today, I gave it out to the students. So this is my first foray into using ChatGPT in the classroom. So one of the things we know is that ChatGPT is good at some things, but it's not good at all at some other things. So in terms of thinking,
even that can change.
Yeah, that can change, but at least for right now, it's not very good at certain things. And so ChatGPT in particular isn't connected to the internet. So it's not very good at giving information about recent events. So I've designed the homework assignment that I just gave to the students. It is a variation on an assignment I've given before where students write an op-ed. So this is for my data and privacy class, my data and society class, but we're right in the area of data privacy. So they're supposed to write an op-ed about a present day issue that relates to data privacy. So, since it's a recent issue, ChatGPT is going to be limited in value. I've given them guidelines. So looking at some of the teaching blogs, and we had the Teaching and Learning Center come to my department and give a really wonderful presentation on how to use ChatGPT in teaching. But there's some of the recommended ways of using ChatGPT. If you're stuck, it can help you get unstuck. If you have a paragraph that maybe you're trying to revise, you can give bits of the paragraph and get revisions for it. So those are some ways maybe you can use it productively. Ways you shouldn't use it to look for citations. You shouldn't use it for recent events, and you shouldn't uncritically generate texts and just submit them without editing. So I'm letting students play with it a bit within the domain of those guidelines. I also have to thank one of the graduate students in our program. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies for the HAS program, and one of our students is Stephen Gonzalez, who has been bringing attention to the environmental costs of using ChatGPT and other LLMs. And there was a recent article also talking about how much water is involved in using these algorithms. So one of the things students are asked to consider also is the environmental cost of their interaction with this model or with this AI, and if that in any way affected their interaction and how they chose to use it in the assignment. So students are going to generate a response paper. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, I am curious to see what they come up with.
Great. John.
I have lots to say. My email inbox used to be all about autonomous vehicles, and now it's just about ChatGPT. So I've been thinking about this a lot, but I just want to emphasize in a way that I think there's so many different responses. There's no tailored answer, and that's because it's a technical intervention, but it's a socio-technical problem. So for me, with a class of 30, it's easy for me to come up with assignments that make students engage with GPT to not just learn how it works, but to inculcate the skills I actually care about. So I can make them do things that make them learn the skills I care about. But in an adjunct teaching 500 people at a state school, that kind of solution's not there. And so it's a socio-technical problem in the sense that it just highlights the ways in which some parts of our education system are overstressed, and they're going to suffer the most. So I don't think there's any broad solution that's not addressing that socio-technical component, as opposed to just coming up. I think we teach a small enough number of students and we engage with the technology enough that we can make tailored solutions. But I don't think there's any.
Actually, I was more interested from my point of view because my students go and develop these models. Mm-hmm. What are the ethical responsibilities when we don't even know how far it'll go? Right? I mean, that is the real question for us.
Yeah, philosophers get asked these kinds of questions all the time, and the answer is you got to do the things everybody up here is saying. You got to draw on all sorts of empirical. You got to draw on all sorts of empirical. You got to go through the method that Milo's describing. You have to sort of figure out what the normative issues are. It raises questions of misinformation. It raises questions of education. It raises questions of bias. And how do we want to put constraints on these things? I mean, what we've seen from ChatGPT is that basically as soon as there was a market force, as soon as OpenAI released ChatGPT, Google dropped its guardrails. So nothing we say here is going to solve the problem in that sense. It's about sort of constraining these things. I don't have a good answer for you. It's go through a process. I don't have the answer for you.
Krishna.
So hi, I'm Krishna Rajagopal from the physics department here at MIT. So I want to ask a completely different question to the three of you as educators. How you navigate achieving the educational goals that you've described in the real world institutions in which you each teach, given all the constraints. So in particular, you're in the Science, Technology, and Society, STS department, philosophy departments. How do you collaborate with computer scientists, both to stay current on the challenges, for example, as we just heard, but really more in terms of how to actually teach computer science students? Are you teaching in classes that are called computer science classes, or are you bringing computer scientists into philosophy classes? These things shouldn't matter, but they do a lot in the real challenge of educating real undergraduates in a real university. How do you navigate these institutional challenges? And also, how would you think about it differently if your goal was teaching all students how to think through these issues as future citizens, rather than how to teach computer science students how to navigate these issues as creators of technology?
I mean, I think that it's going to vary a lot by institution. So I think in particular when we think about computer science, about how are we going to teach computer scientists, setting for later the question of how do we teach everybody. There's already a full computer science curriculum. This has been plotted out. This has been bought into. There are all sorts of stakeholders. There's already sort of a delicate balance of which things are required. People that have different visions of what to do. And now you're saying, okay, there needs to be more of it. We want to teach them something else. And so I think how this works can take different forms. One thing that I think has been a very big institutional success at Harvard is their embedded ethics program, which MIT has our, well, I'm saying ours if I'm still here. MIT has its own sort of version of, where I think what happened there is that what was sort of identified was that the best way to get this ethics material to the computer science students was having one module in each computer science class. So they'll spend a day or two throughout the term, and the thought is that it's sort of like isn't sort of taking away a whole class from the sort of the computer science professors, basically. Another thing that we've done at MIT, or that I did at MIT, was creating a smaller standalone class that fulfills other distribution requirements that they take, but sort of sits alongside and integrates with to get them to see the ethical implications of what they themselves are doing.
I'm happy to go, but.
I can just say briefly. So I'm a big fan of co-teaching. And so right now I'm co-teaching with Professor Sarah Williams, who you heard speak earlier today. And so she is a data scientist. I'm coming from the humanities, part of MIT. We work together to design a class. Our data and society class is scheduled around, it's structured around the life cycle of a data science project. So in moving students through the life cycle of a data science project, they encounter, the different social and ethical issues that they might, find along the way, as well as doing work with data. So students are asked to do technical work as well as more critical humanities kind of work in the course of the class. So for me, co-teaching and working with people in other departments who are teaching students in different ways has been a good way to make sure the information I'm providing is relevant to the training of people in technical fields.
Yeah, I'll just add, at our institution, we're fortunate to have a lot of buy-in from the College of Computer Science, Corey College of Computer Science. So the students, about 2/3 take a pure philosophy class on ethics of technology. Then they get the kind of Harvard-style embedded ethics modules across their upper-level curriculum. So they have a framework they're given. We call it value analysis and design. They're given this framework, and they deploy it across different courses in their curriculum, so they get re-exposed to it within their computer science classes and in a much more concrete way. But thinking about this ecosystemically, I really do agree that it's not just about computer science. So we're developing modules that we're deploying in the design school, that we're deploying in the health sciences, that we're going to deploy in the business school. We also need to develop AI modules for the humanities students and for other decision makers, because part of combating something like ChatGPT is understanding how it works, understanding why is it so bad at chess. Because thinking creatively about how to teach well about, or how to use GPT in the classroom means understanding how it works, and most people in the humanities just think it's magic. So I do think we need this kind of broad ecosystemic approach where we have not just the core ethical reasoning, not just the modules for computer scientists, but modules for all people in the decision-making pipeline and citizens.
So I know there are more questions, but unfortunately we're already 10 minutes over. So speaking entirely without their permission, I can say you're all going to be at the reception. Is that correct? So I'm sure they'll be delighted to answer your questions there. Thank you all three.